Okay, again, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. If you've missed the previous Humankind events, you can view the recordings on the Humankind website, which is humankindwscc.org. You can still experience Claire Ashley's art on campus and at the Ludington Area Center for the Arts. If you haven't seen it yet, you can't miss it. It's big and bright and inflated, and some of it blinks. It's really, really fantastic. It's really cool stuff. So as you may know, our theme this academic year is movement. Tonight, we're going to talk about social mobility, which might seem abstract until you think about phrases like move it on up or social climber or upwardly mobile. But I'm going to let our presenter take it from here. So Dr. Erwin Selimos is West Shore Community College's Professor of Sociology. And thank you so much for being here, Dr. Selimos.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure, as always. I was very excited when you approached me with the opportunity to do a presentation because not very many people listen to sociologists, so we like to actually a lot when we get the opportunity. And you know, I just have to say that everyone's doing such a good job in all these panels. I've attended several of them, and they've been really great. And so hopefully I can carry on with that tradition.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not worried.
So would you like me to just jump right into the presentation and then go from there? Or?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Just jump right in. I'm going to turn my video off and mute. So you've got the floor.
Okay. Okay, so I'll share my screen here and then, so can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see this presentation, Renee? Can you see it? Okay. Oh, wait a second, one sec. Okay, is that better? Okay, so well, welcome everybody to my presentation tonight. As Renee said, my name is Erwin Selimos, and I'm the Professor of Sociology at West Shore Community College. And the title of my presentation tonight is going to be Growing Up Rural, Opportunity Gaps for Young People in Rural America. So what I would like to do is just before I jump into the sort of the content of what I want to talk about tonight, I'll just give you a short overview of who I am. So you sort of know some of the things that I'm interested in as a professor of sociology and as a sociologist, and also as someone who is just concerned about or interested in issues around society. So as I said before, I teach all the sociology courses here, and I see that I have a lot of my students who have, or some of my students who have come in to attend this lecture. And in terms of my training as a sociologist, I've focused a lot of my research on the sociology of childhood and youth and socialization. And this is really related to my past professional experience as a high school teacher. I've always been very interested in questions of how children are treated in society, questions about how we socialize the next generation, and the challenges that are involved with bringing up children in our modern society. I've always believed that if you look at what's happening to kids and if you look at what's happening to children and youth, it tells you quite a bit about the dynamics of the society, some of the problems that it might be facing, and also some of the challenges that we have as a society more generally. So as Renee mentioned, the Humankind Project this year, the theme has been on movement. And it's a broad term, and in sociology, one of the major areas of study is the study of social mobility. And this refers to the capacity for people and different social classes to move up and down the social ladder. And I thought that it would be a fascinating sort of presentation to take up the issue of social mobility and ask the questions about, well, what is the state of social mobility right now in American society? What are the factors that are influencing whether or not a person can move from working class to the middle class, or from poverty to becoming rich? And what are some of the major trends and insights that sociologists themselves are noticing impacting issues around social mobility? So before I jump into the main topics of my presentation, I'm just very curious to learn about what were some of the motivations of people who are out there and listening to me for wanting to come to this presentation. What motivated you to come to this presentation, and what were you hoping to learn by listening to a presentation on opportunity gaps among rural youth? So if you wouldn't mind yeah?
Yeah, so if folks would like to answer, you can type it into the chat or the Q&A. The attendees won't be able to see what's typed out, but we can read it out.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. So I know that people have particular interests. I'm just curious as to why they tuned in tonight at 7 p.m. Well, one person, I think that's Natalie, said, "I'm curious to see whether you also touch on some of the strengths that childhood in the countryside gives you." We may talk about that. My presentation probably won't directly address that, but in the question and answer period, that might be a really good topic to discuss. Oh, we had another person write that we all grew up in Mason County, and I want to know how growing up in Mason County has affected my mentality. That's a great reason. And of course, Katie Smith said, for extra credit for bioethics, but also she lives in a rural area and she has 4 kids. So I imagine that she is interested in learning about some of the challenges, perhaps, and relating this to her role as a mother. And then Lisa wrote that she's interested in equity issues, and especially around childhood. And some other people like Mike Nagel, who says he's always been interested in social mobility in the US and rural life versus urban communities. So those are all absolutely wonderful motivations and reasons to be involved in this presentation. And I hope that if I don't address those questions or those concerns directly in my presentation, that it could be something that those questions can be taken up during the question and answer period. So this slide right here is just a general overview of what my presentation is going to entail. The first thing that I would like to do is I would like to just talk briefly about what sociologists and other social scientists have documented in terms of the emerging and growing concern over the American dream, which is the dream of social mobility, the capacity for people to work hard and move up the social ladder. And then I'm going to be speaking a lot today about the changing dynamics of socialization of young children and the effects that these socialization gaps are having on opportunities for young people in general. And I'll be speaking a lot about the changing nature of family life, issues around school, and issues around the changing nature of the American community. And we'll be exploring some of the changing nature of these social institutions are having significant implications for how working class and poor children access opportunities, and also for how middle and upper middle class children access opportunities. And then I would like to end the discussion with a short talk about some of the avenues for action for addressing some of the problems that I present in this particular presentation. So in around 2012 and 2015, 2 books were published by 2 very famous sociologists and political scientists, one by the name of Charles Murray, and the other social scientist by the name of Robert D. Putnam. And Charles Murray's book was entitled Coming Apart, and Robert Putnam's book was called Our Kids. And what's really interesting about these 2 books is that both of them present despite the fact, I should say, that the 2 authors come from very different political orientations. Charles Murray is a conservative sociologist, and I guess you would say that Robert Putnam is more of a liberal social scientist. When you read their book together, there's two books together that were published around the same time, you're shocked by the same conclusions in terms of the trends over social mobility that these two social scientists document in their books. In fact, when I read these two books, I read them around the same time. The first 2/3 of the book, it almost felt like they were copy and pasting from each other. They were talking about the same types of trends. They were talking about the same concerns over the growing social segregation in American society by social class. And I thought that this was really interesting because when you have two social scientists of different sort of leanings start identifying similar trends, you know that something is happening. And one of the things that both of these authors show is that over the last 30 to 40 years, there have been significant transformations in terms of the the experiences and socialization experiences of middle class and upper class kids and their working class and poor children's experiences. And that this growing class division in American society is, as Robert Putnam writes, showing that that rich Americans and poor Americans are living, learning, and raising children in increasingly separate and unequal worlds, which are removing the stepping stones to upward mobility for the more disadvantaged students, young people in American society. So today, the four big questions that I would like to address is, well, what are the factors that are contributing to the growing opportunity gaps among rich children and poor children? How do these, so I'll be talking a lot about national trends that sociologists are documenting in terms of the socialization contexts of the different, of children of different social classes. And then I'll discuss a little bit about how these national trends are playing out in rural America, what the implications of these trends are, and of course, what, if anything, can be done about them. So in terms of the four main points that I'm going to be talking about throughout this entire lecture, these are the four things that I want to sort of highlight. The first main point that I want to just put up front for everybody is that over the last 30 to 40 years, the United States and other advanced industrial countries have experienced fundamental transformations to the economy. And these transformations are requiring young people to gain new types of competencies in order to transition effectively into the labor market and to establish their adult lives. But one of the concerns that is emerging is that there is a growing social class gap in how young people are actually being prepared for this modern economy. And that these socialization gaps are becoming, in a lot of ways, opportunity gaps. And that these national patterns that I'll be showing to you are rural patterns. And that these socialization gaps are limiting the opportunities for disadvantaged young people. And by doing so, are depriving society of potential talent and human resources. So I've been using two words that I think are really important to define before I go on and talk more briefly about these social trends. And the two words that I want you to have a clear understanding about, because it's going to help you sort of understand more generally the statistics and the trends that I'm going to discuss, are the concepts of socialization and the concept of competence. So all societies, let me go back, I'm sorry, to this slide. All societies, in order to function, have to ensure that the members of those societies have particular skills and attributes and values that allow society to function. And so, in other words, the type of society you live in determines the necessary competencies. And what I mean by these are the skills, the knowledge, and attitude that make for a functioning individual in the economy and in society. And that it's this socialization process, which we define in sociology as the way in which we upbring children, how we educate children, that gives these children the types of skills and attitudes and values that are necessary for their transition into the adult world, to become workers and to become citizens. And the socialization process in our modern society is one that takes a very long time. And it includes an array of different, we use this term in sociology called socializing agents. It starts in the family among parents, it moves into the peer group, then children move into the schools, and then there's other community institutions like church and work that also act as a way of equipping young people with the types of skills and attitudes, values, and knowledge that allow them to function in society. In other words, and you can look at this short little diagram that I have over here on the side, society determines the types of skills that are needed for people to survive in that society. And it's through the socialization process that we learn those competencies. So here you see a beautiful image of a hunting and gathering society. And I like this image because it's a really good way to think about this idea of competencies and socialization. So you can look at this picture and you can imagine in your mind all the types of skills and all the types of knowledge that young people need to be taught in order for them to survive as a hunter-gatherer society, and in order for the society, therefore, to continue its existence. So if you were a young child in this society, you would have to learn, for example, how to hunt. You would have to learn the tracking patterns of all the different types of animals. You would have to learn and you'd have to be taught the different types of plants that you could eat, which plants are edible, which aren't, and which seasons. And you would have to learn all sorts of complex forms of knowledge and complex forms of skills in order to become a competent member of that particular society. So it is the socialization process by which we develop the competencies to function in society, and thereby which helps our society work. Now, of course, we don't live in hunter-gatherer society. We live in a very complex, technologically driven, post-industrial society. And over the last, let's say, 40 years, the United States, the main situation in the United States has been the rapid transformation of both our economy and our society. And we have transitioned in many ways from what sociologists refer to an industrial society to a post-industrial society. And this transition to a post-industrial society means that our children and our members of society need to learn new types of skills in order to function properly, in order to make the appropriate transition from youth into adulthood. And our society, I guess you could say, is defined by three major characteristics. The first most important characteristic of our modern society is that we have a very complex occupational system. There are a lot of jobs, and these jobs require different types of skills, and they require different types of expertise. And this occupational system, which is largely driven by technology, is constantly changing. And so you hear this quote sometimes, I think it comes from an OECD report that was published maybe 10 years ago, that about 60% of the jobs that grade 3 students will be performing when they're adults have not even yet been invented. So we have a very complex occupational system. We also have an economy and a society that is very strongly technologically driven, and that is also characterized by very complex forms of social and cultural diversity. And so in a society like this, what you see is the emergence or the need for very particular types of skills and knowledge that we have to develop in our children. And I have a list on the side here of what some sociologists and economists see as the core skills that are necessary in order to establish good work lives and good social lives as adults. First, you need very advanced communication skills. You have to have strong linguistic capacities. You have to be a good writer. And especially, you have to have really strong interpersonal skills, because a lot of the emerging jobs are jobs that you do with other people. And so this means that our economy exerts a force on individuals in which they need to develop strong verbal, written, and interpersonal skills. Because jobs and occupations are changing so rapidly, it also means that the individual has to be very flexible. They have to have the capacity to learn new skills as new technologies are introduced into their jobs, or introduced into their work lives. And they have to be self-directed in trying to adjust to those changes. And third, our young people or people who are establishing adult lives need to have strong technological or technical knowledge and expertise. They need what some sociologists and other educational thinkers call these 21st century skills. And if you have these skills, then your transition from a youth into adulthood through the establishment of your work lives becomes much easier. So what's the implication of this, of the demands of a sort of techno-commercial, highly post-industrial society? What implications does this change in our structure of our society have on what children, in terms of children and youth development? I would say that there are probably one of the most important factors of this change in our economic system and our society is that it means that increasingly our young people have to attend some form of post-secondary education or training. What I mean by this is not just get a bachelor's degree, but a high school diploma, and only a high school diploma, no longer is going to cut it in the modern economy. The transition to a post-industrial society has extended the period of time that is necessary for children to stay in the education system. And so what we have developed now is sort of a childhood and a youth that is defined by an educational marathon. You need to stay in school, and you need to stay in school for a long time to get that type of training necessary for your eventual transition into the labor market. And so in order to survive, I guess you can say, the educational marathon, what that means is that young people require a lot of social support. And they require a social support to first be able to manage the complexity of society and the economic system. And what this means is that coming from a strong and secure and stable family is increasingly a very important factor for the social mobility of children as they age into adulthood. Young people also need social supports in order to survive and thrive in this educational marathon. And so they need to be equipped with relatively strong academic foundations in reading and writing and math literacy. And they have to have a strong valuation of education in order for them to be able to survive the increasingly longer times they're spending in educational environments. And the third most important form of social support is that young people need more and more guidance in trying to navigate the really complex occupational environments. And so I'm going to be talking about, as we continue with this presentation, the essential need for career and life guidance to help young people who are making this move into the economy with trying to figure out what types of careers, because the occupational system is very complex, what type of careers will work for them. Of course, the implication is if that young people lack these social supports, then it becomes increasingly difficult for them to establish adult social roles. The unfortunate reality, and it's a reality that more and more sociologists are documenting, and it really started with Robert Putnam work on Our Kids, is that we are seeing a growing socialization gap between how young people are actually being prepared for the modern economy and the modern society. And we're seeing, in fact, a widening divergence, a growing gap between young people's socialization context. And this gap is primarily a gap that is associated with a young person's social class. And so you can see that I've tried to represent this trend by demonstrating these two little lines here and the bubbles. What we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years is that there's growing gaps between the way that middle and upper class children are being socialized for their transition into the modern society compared to the way that working class and poor students are being prepared for the modern society. And you can see these gaps in the quality of in the nature of family life, in school experiences, and in their very experiences of the local community and the types of social connections that we have. And the main argument that I'm going to show and try and demonstrate to you is that this growing gap in the socialization context of upper and middle class kids compared to their working and poor counterparts is increasingly an opportunity gap. So now I'm going to jump into some empirical work, and I'm going to show you some statistics around family. So I'm going to show you some statistics around school, and I'm going to show you some statistics and findings around community life as a way of demonstrating to you that this growing gap between the rich and poor children and the way they're being prepared for modern economy is in fact a real trend. And it's a trend that goes across national borders. And it's also a trend that is demonstrated within rural communities themselves. So let me just start by giving you a short little warning about statistics. Sociologists, we love statistics because to us, statistics are the way that we get insight into social patterns. It's one of the tools we use as sociologists to say, look at these trends across these different groups, look what's happening. And so statistics are for us like a type of poetry because they give us a sense of the big picture that oftentimes our own individual observations might miss. The warning about statistics is that they represent general trends. So when you're thinking about this material in relation to your own life, you will be able to find exceptions. But remember, as sociologists, our job is to look at these general trends and to ask ourselves, okay, what's going on? And what are some of the factors and the reasons that are producing these tendencies across the different social classes? So the first major socialization gap that is starting to emerge in, well, not starting to emerge, but that's intensifying in social research is the widening gap between young people who are living in stable families and who are experiencing different amounts of parental investment in their early childhood and in their development through adolescence. And what we see is a difference based on the social class of the child in terms of how stable of a family those children will enjoy, and also how much investment in educational activities those children will receive. So let's talk a little bit about the issue of familial stability. So on this slide, I took these two really interesting charts from an article that was written by Bradford Wilcox and Wendy Wang. And the name of the article is listed right here. It's called The Marriage Divide: How and Why Working Class Families Are More Fragile Today Than They've Ever Been. And what you can see here in this chart is the share of the first one. Oops, I'm sorry. The first chart right here is the share of the share of adults aged 18 to 55 who are currently married by class. And one of the first things that should pop out to you is that middle and upper middle class families are increasingly characterized by relatively stable marriage patterns. And so in the 70s and 80s, we saw a skyrocketing rate of divorce. And this was across all social classes. However, in the 90s and 2000s and up into today, we've seen a stabilization of marriage among middle-class families. We, however, have not seen that same stabilization among poor and working class families. So what you get is a picture in which college-educated and more affluent Americans are enjoying relatively strong and stable marriages and the economic and the social benefits that flow from these marriages. Whereas working class Americans are facing rising rates of familial instability, and many children are being raised in single parent families and or lifelong singleness. They're not even many working class children, people are not even actually getting married. And so you have this, what sociologists, especially Bradford and Wilcox, call a marriage divide. And this raises sometimes concerns for sociologists because we know that positive youth development requires that children have strong and stable social bonds at a very young age in order to develop the type of secure emotional attachments that allow them to be successful in school and eventually navigate the complexities of the modern world. This graph here represents the growing divide in the expenditures that middle and upper middle class families provide on the education of the children compared to the bottom income quintiles of the American population. And what you see is that since the 1970s, the top earning families are spending more and more and more money on educationally enriching activities, going on trips to museums, buying educational toys. There's a strong, strong emphasis and concern of paying attention to deliberate cognitive development of these children. But the same levels of expenditures are not rising among the lower socioeconomic class families. And so what we're seeing is a growing divide in terms of the educational investments into children. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and part of the reason is the amount of disposable income, but that's something that we can maybe take up during the discussion and talk a little bit more about the nuances of this particular chart. What's significant is that what we find, and this relates to the second socialization gap, is because of the changing nature of the family, the high, stable, generally stable families in the upper and middle class with high emphasis on educational investments, and the churning of families in the lower and socioeconomic class status, what we find is that when children enter school, there's a significant gap in how ready, and the term that is often used in educational jargon is school readiness, how ready those children are for the school environment. There's a very important book, and you can see I took a screenshot of it, and it's on the right-hand side of your screen. It's called Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experiences of Young American Children. And this book was published originally in the mid-90s, around 1995. And it was an ethnographic study of language use in the families of different social classes. And what they found was that middle and upper middle class children, on average, so they went into homes and they actually observed how parents spoke with and the language uses of parents within the house. And what they found was that the upper and middle class children, on average, heard about 30 million more words before entering school than their working class and poor children counterparts. And so we're seeing, as children enter, even into kindergarten, significant social class differences in the vocabulary, language development of the children. Now, why is this important? Why do we care about vocabulary? Because vocabulary is the basis for, there's two reasons. First, when children are exposed to broad-based vocabulary and they've been exposed to sophisticated language, it provides them with the first steps to learning how to read. It also, which is a major, major, major skill for success in the school environment. Also, it's through language that children learn sort of the give and take and the routines of what and the question and answer routines that occur in the school. It's also, vocabulary is kind of an indicator that sociologists use to assess the general knowledge levels of children. The more vocabulary a child has, the more they know about stuff. And the more you know about stuff, the more likely you can build on that knowledge. I always say to my students, knowledge is like money. The more you have of it, the more you can make. And so what we see is that students are already coming in with significant differences in vocabulary and language development. They're also coming in with different levels of social emotional control and skills of managing emotions. And sociologists argue that that has something to do with the instabilities experienced by working class children in those very fragile family forms. The unfortunate thing is that these gaps in language and social emotional control, they tend to persist through school. The school system doesn't necessarily close these early social class gaps, but rather what happens is they tend to persist. And there's different theories as to why those social gaps persist. Some sociologists point to the theory of the self-fulfilling prophecy, in which children develop learning identities of what they can and can't do. And by grade 3 or grade 4, those learning identities are pretty solidified. And so children are already that early, already saying to themselves, well, you know, school's not really for me. Some other sociologists and educators point to perhaps insufficient curricula and insufficient early interventions into learning problems, and also different qualities, different school quality depending on the region that you're living in. So here's the picture so far. We have a gap in the quality in the nature of family life based on social class, and this is then carried into the school system, and in the school system we see an increasing gap between the social classes. The third major socialization gap has to do with the nature of non-education, non-family members, and the number of informal social supports that children have depending on their social class background. And one of the key things that you find when you read this literature is that working class kids and poor children are increasingly lonely and they're increasingly isolated, and they don't have access to the same number of mentors, adult mentors in their life that could help them proceed through the education system and establish themselves as adults later on. And Robert Putnam talks about this stark contrast in how a lack of access to these mentors in young people's capacity to understand the very institutions like schools that actually would provide them with opportunities. And we see this difference in informal mentorship and social supports, these social class differences, when we look at things like the rates of participation in extracurricular activities. Middle class and upper middle class children are much more likely to be participating in sports and a variety of after school activities. And also the access to mentors, informal mentors who can help young people, guide young people in their transition into adulthood, and even in participation in institutions like church, we see a social class gap. So I copy and pasted, I took a picture of two really important graphs from Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, which I really do suggest that you read. And they get at this point that when it comes to looking at the social networks and the range of mentors that children have, what you see is that if you look at the social class differences between poor and working class children and upper and middle class children, that that upper and middle class children have more of these informal mentors, and they have a broader range of supports outside of their family and outside of the school. You can see, for example, on the chart figure 5.3, it compares youth from the bottom socioeconomic status and the top socioeconomic status. The top socioeconomic status is, of course, the richer students. They're in black. And you can see right there's one bar that deals with any non-family member. They have informal mentors for someone who is not an informal family member. And you can see a stark difference between 35 to 40% of poor children say that they have such access to such mentors, where 65 to 70% of upper and middle class children having access to these mentors. Here's an interesting graph that shows the participation rates in church. And church is a really important thing to look at because it still remains one of the major community-based institutions in the American society. And it's in churches where young people actually develop a lot of access to informal mentors and kind of social connections that are necessary for their development. Now, while we see a general trend in this graph of declining participation in church, which is probably not surprising to many people who are listening to this presentation, what you also continue to see is that the black line representing the upper third of the socioeconomic status, and then the lower third is represented by the gray, a significant gap based on social class. So how do these gaps in family stability, these gaps in school experiences, and these gaps in community life, how do they play out in rural communities? And one of the big takeaways is that these national trends are observable in rural communities as well. There's an added problem, however, which is that there is the problem of population declines in rural communities due primarily to the outmigration of many young people. And you'd be surprised to find that there is not if you were to look at the research on young people growing up in rural youth, if you look at the sociological research, it's actually quite small. There's not a lot of work done on how young people come of age in rural America. We are an urban-centric society, and so there's a lot of research on urban youth, but not much research on rural youth. There is, however, this wonderful book called Hollowing Out the Middle, which was an ethnographic study of a small town in Iowa. And it's written by Patrick Carr and Maria Kafalis. And really what they were interested in studying when they started their research was, how do young people who live in small towns come of age? And they moved, they're a married couple, and they moved into this small town, and they lived there for like 5 years. And they, believe it or not, interviewed almost like 85% of the people who lived in this community. So this is like a really interesting study. And they were interested in the big question of, how do youth come of age in this small town? And what they learned from talking to young people is that there were young people, by the time they were late adolescence, were concerned with answering two really important questions. The first was, do I stay in this community or do I go? And then the second question was, if I go, do I come back? Do I come back to raise my children? And what they found was that young people fell into essentially 5 major categories. You had the achievers, you had the seekers, the stayers, the boomerangers, and the high flyers. The achievers were primarily upper and middle class kids who had enjoyed very strong social supports. They came from stable middle class families, and they were the top athletes and the top academic students of those communities. And it was clear from the beginning of their education that they were destined to leave. And it was their desire to go to university, to leave, get out of Dodge, leave to go to a university and establish a life somewhere else. And in fact, they were actively encouraged by the school system and by their families to do that. The other group, the seekers, were a group of working class kids who were not academically the best. They weren't the star athletes. They weren't the great students. They came from working class backgrounds. They wanted to get out, but they didn't have the same types of resources as the achievers did. And so what they did was they joined the military. And the military became sort of an escape route for these working class kids to get out, go see the world, and try and build their skills that way. A third group were the stayers. And the stayers were primarily working class children who did not want to leave. They liked living in rural areas. They weren't attracted by the urban regions. And they were not academically oriented, but they knew that they wanted to stay in that local community. The boomerangers were typically young, women who left and got associate's degrees and eventually came back and worked in sort of like what we call like mid-level, middle-class positions as like dental hygienists and things like this. And then you had the high flyers who were former achievers who said, oh, I want to go raise my kids in the community that I grew up in. And they came back and they became the doctors and the lawyers. And what you found was that the communities put a lot of emphasis on trying and recruiting these high flyers. So why is this book so important and how does it relate to what I'm talking about today? First of all, it's important because what you find when you read this study is that most of the community resources and most of the education focused on the achievers. And they were destined, so in other words, we were increasingly investing our resources into the population of students that were destined to leave and that wanted to leave. But stayers and returners, we didn't see the same types of community investments into this group of people, into the working class kids. And they became relatively underprepared for the modern economy. The third major issue that emerges from reading this book is that the outmigration of young people produced very high levels of social segregation in this community. And so what you saw was that people lived parallel lives. You had the middle-class families who interacted with middle-class families who had middle-class activities, and the working-class families who did their own thing. It was like one community, but within that community, there were like two tiers of a parallel society. Of course, because of the way that social segregation negatively affects disadvantaged people, the deck was stacked against these working-class kids. So, to summarize my argument so far, fundamental transformations in the economy require that young people accumulate particular types of skills and knowledge. But growing socialization gaps in the families, in communities, and in schools shows us that young people are being prepared differently for the modern economy. Some are being prepared quite well. Middle and upper middle class kids are transitioning quite well. But working class kids are really struggling. And that these national patterns are rural patterns, and that these socialization gaps are producing opportunity gaps that are depriving young people of opportunities, especially working class kids, and depriving society of the type of potential talent that could really, we could all benefit from.
I just wanted to, sorry, Professor, I wanted to break in quickly. Just wanted to draw your attention to the clock that it's about 10 to 8.
Sure. I'm gonna finish in 5 minutes, so I'm good.
Awesome.
So in terms of the limitations of I focused a lot on socialization, and I looked at the variable of social class. I didn't really get into how social mobility might be impacted by other important variables like race and ethnicity. I didn't really I didn't do a gender analysis of the different ways that men and women are being prepared for the modern society and modern economy, nor did I really attend to issues of sexual orientation or disability. Didn't really talk that much about the role of discrimination in limiting opportunities, And I didn't talk very much about the growing economic inequalities and how that is actually related to social mobility. But we could talk about those during the question and answer period. So what do you do about this problem? This is always the big question that people ask sociologists. You identify these issues, so what do we do? For me, I think the most important thing that we have to take into account is we have to think about preparing children through the life cycle, okay? That families and schools, and of course, higher education and then work, we have to think of them as kind of an integrated system in which we are developing children for life. And one of the best ways to approach the problem of these opportunity gaps is to prevent the development of negative developmental cycles and to promote positive developmental cycles. Okay, so you want to intervene very early in the lives of children, because the earlier you intervene and you can disrupt the negative cycles, the easier it is to correct, and the easier it is to get children back onto a path that will lead them to some type of success in their life. So how can you do that? Well, one important way to do that is to build on already existing programs that many communities have that are trying to do exactly this. So we need to invest in a lot in supporting family stability because of how positive and important it is to the development of children. We have to figure out ways of supporting and enhancing already existing early childhood initiatives. We have to support and make sure that school curricula is a good curriculum that addresses the types of learning issues that you see early on in children, and that we have very well-funded intervention programs for children. We also have to do a good job in our communities of mentoring young people and developing types of mentorship programs and cultivating participation among young people in pro-social extracurricular activities. And then finally, we have to figure out ways of developing effective career and education guidance and coaching. And I'm thinking specifically about those kids like the stayers and what were they called? The stayers and the seekers, those who are not necessarily oriented to theoretical work that often happens at universities, but who have a lot of opportunities if you can get them into really strong vocational careers and technical careers. I have a picture here of a really wonderful book that talks about exactly that, about figuring out ways of developing career and education guidance to stream children into these types of occupations that do not necessarily require four-year degrees, but actually can lead to very strong livelihoods and that are probably more associated with the type of work that many working class and poor children want to do. The other thing, and this is my final slide, Renee, is that one of the things, despite all those programs that individuals can do, is they cannot wait to let other people do the work, but they can jump in and do it. And I know that, there's a lot of people, there's all the people who are listening to this presentation, you all have skills. Some of you may have been retired teachers. Some of you may have been athletes before when you were younger, and you know things about track and field and soccer. You all have skills and you all have talents, and you can assist in supporting and cultivating our young people. And you can do that now by getting involved in mentorship programs, by going to the local school and saying, hey, I want to work as a coach, I want to tutor, I want to help with some of your reading recovery programs. There's a lot of things that you can do, because one of the most interesting social science research findings is that if a child has at least one person in their life who cares for them, the chances that they will successfully develop into an adult is increasing, is much more likely. The presence of one caring adult can really make or break the development of a child. And so one of the things that you can do now is you can get involved, start volunteering, and find out what your talents are and start teaching young people around your own talents. Okay, that's my presentation. I know I talked for a very long time. It's your fault because you asked a sociologist to do a presentation, but I'm very curious to learn about what people think about this issue, what their thoughts are on the presentation, if they have any questions, and I guess we can just take it from there.
Thank you so much. That was
So
super interesting.
I'm going to stop sharing. Is that okay?
Sure. Yep,
Okay.
that's perfect. Yeah, sorry for interrupting you.
No, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did.
So we already have a question. So Natalie wants to know, I wonder how these out-migration trends have changed or will change because of the pandemic, especially as remote work gives the achievers greater opportunities to return to rural spaces, but still remain part of the 21st century economy.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I guess, COVID, it's hard to know. I know that one of the things that I've been hearing a lot about is that COVID has changed people's expectations of where and how they want to work. And there's a growing number of people who are like, working from home wasn't so bad, eh? And I guess I could, if you're a computer programmer and you can do things online and you can buy a nice house in the country and you have good internet and cable, that there's that possibility. So it's a really great question. I guess I can say, we have to wait for the data to come in. One of the things that remains clear is that a lot of rural revitalization, because there is a lot of concern about dying rural communities, a lot of the revitalization approaches have been about trying to draw back achievers into our community. And so rural communities have spent a lot of money on campaigns and even offering these achievers, these young adults who are professionals, grants for down payments on houses to move back into rural areas. Because if you don't replace your population, you have problems sustaining your institutions, right?
Right.
There's a lot of influence doing that. And I think there's a lot of good in those type of drawing back those people into rural areas. I mean, that makes sense. But there is a gap in our intervention, which is, well, what are we doing to cultivate the lives of the people who do already want to stay? What about those stayers? How are we helping those young people through community colleges, for example, to integrate themselves into the modern economy, but help them find the types of jobs that might align with the type of work that they want to do, that they're interested in, but that they might not know about.
Right.
They might not know about, and that's one of the big issues I see. So, thanks, Natalie. I appreciate your question.
So our next question is from Jean, who says, what role does social media play in the needed competencies of advanced communication skills as they relate to young people addicted to their phones social media and don't know how to communicate face to face?
Wait, okay, I got to read that question again because it's very long.
Do you know how to get to the Q&A?
Yeah,
Okay,
Jessica Bates,
cool.
right?
So this one is from Jean Kyle.
Oh, that's from Jean. Okay.
Which is at the top of the list.
I'm sorry, can you read it again? I can't see it, Renee.
Sure. So what role does social media play in the needed competencies of advanced communication skills?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so let me answer that question first. Because, we are doing this really interesting, we're beginning to do this very interesting survey on communication skills in our local economy, and it's spearheaded by our professor of communications. And we're actually asking employers to rate and assess the communication levels of their employees. And we're asking them questions on things like their ability, their employees' writing capacities, their interpersonal and their teamwork skills. And we piloted some surveys just to test our survey. And one of the things that that really struck me that was interesting was that one of the survey respondents said that having the capacity to manage these type of social media accounts is actually a very advantageous skill. Because small companies, for example, are they have Facebook accounts. They're reaching people through Facebook. They're also trying to reach people through their advertising through like a variety of different types of social media platforms, most of which I don't even understand. I don't use. But so having those skills, those multimodal social media skills, is increasingly an important skill in the modern economy because that's how people are communicating and getting their information. There was a second component to that question that was really interesting. Could you read that to me as well?
Sure. So, what role does social media play in the needed competencies of advanced communication skills as they relate to young people who are addicted to their phones and don't know how to communicate face to face?
Oh, yes. Okay. So the notion of the cell phone addictions and the social media addictions, and I would say that we have a lot of conversations in my sociology class among my young people with that. And so, everything is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Having the ability to use these social media accounts can be advantageous, but a lot of my students talk about, for example, how it interferes with their ability to pay attention, and how they will say things to me like, I'm losing the capacity to interact with my fellow man, And so I think that is a legitimate concern. Not to mention, to me, I think the biggest concern with social media and technology use is the kind of some of the health ramifications that we're starting to see in the way that the youth being addicted to these type of forms of technology are disrupting young people's sleep patterns, which is influencing their capacity to learn, and which is influencing their capacity to, just be healthy. And also, changing the nature and how they can pay attention. To me, it's always, the question I always ask myself is, okay, if a kid is playing on the social media and watching Facebook, what are all the other things that they could be doing that they're not because they're playing on their phone? You know what I mean?
Right.
And so they could be talking with their parents in a conversation about something of importance, They could be hanging outside and exercising with their friends. So I think parents and families are facing the challenge of how do you find a balance and how do you negotiate a balance between technology use and all the other things that you need to do. So that's a great question, and it deserves its own humankind presentation.
Do you want to do a sequel?
I don't know if I want to do that, but
So our next question was from Jessica. With the way our economy is currently, how would a family keep their children focused while needing to be a working family? Working in the medical field myself, working remotely is not an option.
Yeah, keep them focused. I don't know who asked that question.
So that's from Jessica Bates.
So Jessica, could you clarify, like when you mean keep them focused, are you referring to like issues around supervision of homework, or do you mean like developing attention spans? Could you clarify what you mean by keeping them focused? It's a great question. I mean, it's the challenge, isn't it?
She says attention spans, developing attention spans. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. A couple of years ago, I read a book by an educational psychologist called Endangered Minds. Her name is Jane Healy, and this book basically tries to address this issue of why teachers and other people who work with young people are witnessing what seems to be a less and less attention span, like a shorter attention span and an inability to control their bodies in a way to actually pay attention when they need to. And she talks about a variety of different factors that are influencing that. But two of them that I thought were really interesting. One had to do with physical activity. One of the things that we're starting to notice is that children are becoming increasingly sedentary, right? They're not moving their bodies very much. And because they're not moving their bodies, it's actually having effects on their cognition and their capacity to pay attention.
Oh, wow.
And so this is really concerning, especially when you start looking about schools that are cutting back on recess time for children, right? They need to move. You need to get them exhausted enough through their bodies so that they can actually focus on boring stuff like math. So I thought that was interesting about this general lifestyle around fitness as being really important. So maybe exercising more. And she also talked about sleep deprivation in children, not sleeping enough and not going to bed at regular times and staying up on their phones and watching TV too late at night. And that's influencing the physiological effects. So there's that level, that I think is like really important. But there's also one of the things that helps us develop our attention spans, according to this book, I'm not an educational psychologist, is talking with people. So when children are young, the more you interact with them and you talk with them, not off a device, and you're just, you're helping them, they're participating in your life and you're telling them what you're doing. You're helping them, like you're getting them to cook with you, and you're asking them questions, and you're pointing things out, and you're really trying to increase the amount you're talking with children. It helps them develop their executive functions. And it's the executive function that helps them with their long-term attention span. So I guess the question is, it's not why is it that children can't pay attention, because we're all driven to distraction. The question is, what is it that people who have good attention spans, what do they do that allow them to have that? And it seems to me general fitness, physical health, exercise is one thing, sleep is another thing, but so too is interpersonal interactions, talking with your children and trying to spend that quality time together so that they develop these executive function skills. I don't know if that answers your question, because your immediate concerns, but that's what Jane Healy, it's a wonderful book. It's called Endangered Minds. It was published about 15 years ago.
Oh, she says, yes, it does. And thank you. So that's
great. And I hope that, I think that that's the challenge for a lot of families, negotiating really busy lives. How do you spend time together in that context? It's a huge problem.
So similar to that, Chloe asks, do you believe that a child who has access to technology too young can stunt their development?
That's a good question. Do I personally believe? I would say that I'm not an early childhood development expert. So it's really hard for me to say exactly what effects exposure to media, television, screen time, technology has on the early development of children's brains. But my reading of, for example, child moral development and children's cognitive development, and physical development, it all points to the necessity for face-to-face interaction with people, with parents who are, like bringing the child close to their face and making goo goo gaga sounds and talking with their kids and wrestling with them. It seems to me that that's where it's at when it comes to cognitive and moral, and you have to establish those type of relationships first. And so the less, the better.
Thank you.
And so that places a lot of responsibility on parents to, figure out how they're going to draw those boundaries when they themselves might be exhausted. And, it's a It's a big challenge that many families face, and it's a real challenge. It's really funny, you know. I presented a lot based on Robert Putnam, and he wrote a famous book in the 90s called Bowling Alone. And one of the things that he writes in that book was how the negative influence of the introduction of television on the cohesion of our neighborhoods. Because before television, you had the radio, but most people went outside, and they, because they didn't have anything to do inside, so they sat on their stoops. And because they sat on their stoops, they interacted with their neighbors, and they actually knew who their neighbors were, and they had conversations. And then when the television came in, it pulled people's leisure activity inside the house, and it diminished the degrees of social interaction that they had with their neighbors. And so he wrote, in fact, negatively on how this introduction of television was having on our social relationships. But it's funny to read that book now in the context of social media and in the context of, you know, cell phones and Twitter and all that sort of stuff. It's even more difficult now.
Right.
It's not just turning off the TV and saying, hey, you only get TV Saturday mornings, boy. Now you have to worry about all this other stuff.
So you were talking about in hollowing out the middle, you were talking about achievers, that like separate group. And Lisa asks, don't we need those achievers to come back to actually be mentors to those who stay?
And you know, that is a part of the revitalization, the attraction of the achievers back into the community. That's why those revitalization programs do focus on that, because if you have the exodus of the middle class is often the stabilizing force in a society. And so if you don't have those people, then who's going to mentor? Who's going to take the positions that, you know, like the teaching positions, the doctor positions, et cetera. And so it is true. And that's why I say that trying to figure out ways of keeping those kids here is actually quite important, because you need to keep the demography going. A society that is losing children is a society that is dying. And so that is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. The other piece, as I said before, is in addition to that, you also have to do something to support the stayers. You also have to do something to support. So it's a multi-pronged intervention approach. You know, there's many dimensions to it that you have to take care of, which makes it challenging.
Oh, I see. So George had a question. Let's see.
George, my student, George?
Yes, I think so.
He always has questions. That's what I love about him.
So he said, would you consider advanced classes more of a detriment to the gap in education? And by advanced classes, he means like an AP class where they pull you out, or dual enrollment class.
So, you know, there's a huge debate among this kind of, we call it tracking, you know, where you put like tracking is an educational policy where you group similar skilled students together. So you put the high academic achieving students with high academic skills together, and you put like the weaker students together. And the logic behind tracking and AP and all this sort of stuff is that you can then target the needs of the students more accurately. And I think there's truth to that. Also, it produces additional problems. And this is the reason why, because when you it's like when you separate out these students, it actually, what occurs is oftentimes the best teachers become the teachers of the best students. And the students that are the weakest don't always have the most experienced teachers. So you have that issue. You also have the development of behavioral problems in the lower academic class structures, the class systems too. And you also, then you get different expectations for those students, and tracking, some sociologists argue that tracking actually exacerbates the problem. The other issue, however, and so that one I don't have an answer to. It can go both ways, is what I'm saying. It's very complicated. The other issue that I think George is alluding to is, okay, you have all these AP classes that are there, but not all kids are interested in that. But those kids are good kids too, and they deserve to have their talents cultivated. Mm-hmm. One of the saddest things that has occurred is the diminishment of our funding of things like vocational training, like shop class. And we do have those programs, like I think about the CTE program, and those are really, really, really great. But if you cut out those programs in our schools, what's keeping some of those non-academically oriented kids in school?
Right.
There's nothing that's attracting them. There's nothing that's integrating them into the school. So I think that it is a shame, and that's why I presented that one book that talked about educational roads less traveled. I think that it's a shame that, okay, we can offer these honors classes and we can fight who gets into them, but there's all these other things that are important too, and that can really set young people up for success as they transition out. And it seems like it's one of those things, you have to think through all the dimensions of the problem, and there's not one thing that solves it. There's not one solution. So George, just so you know, in about a month, we're going to study education in schools, and we're going to talk exactly about the issue you just brought up. So I hope you look forward to that.
So it looks like Jeremy wanted a little bit of clarification about separating out the groups of students. Does that push the lower level kids to get better, or does it undermine them to do less?
It depends who you ask. And it's always fun to ask this question to actual high school teachers, because, I don't teach in a high school. So it actually is a very complicated question. And I think people have a lot of different perspectives. I know that, generally speaking, you have sociologists that point in both directions. Mm-hmm. You have some sociologists who will say, actually, it lowers what occurs in practice is the students who are placed in those lower classes, they get lower expectations placed upon them, and their lower expectations, then it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're more likely to kind of become disengaged. But when you group them with more higher ability students, it actually has a positive effect on bringing up their academic success. That integrating the students doesn't really have that big of an effect on high achieving students, but it has a positive effect on low achieving students for a variety of reasons, I think. But to do that is actually it's a very hard decision, because you are going to have to deal with the politics that comes with that, because parents might not like that. Parents will fight in this type of bringing together. Well, I want my kid to be in the AP class because he's really talented, and I want him to be with other kids who are academically focused, and I don't want that child to be in a group with kids who aren't academically focused. So you start getting into this issue, and it's a really hard issue, which I have no solution for. So please don't ask me.
You can't solve all of our sociological problems, Erwin.
No, what I do is I identify them, and then I run the other way, because the hard work. I'm just joking. What I mean is that, yes, always a constant discussion. There's always a constant dialogue about this. And we have to, you have to keep figuring out what's going to work in your school, what's the best for these kids, and how are you going to support them. If you choose to separate kids out based on ability levels, what are you doing as an institution and as parents and as teachers and as school administrators to support those lower academically achieving kids? They often need a lot of support, both academically, but in other ways as well. Mm-hmm. And are we offering them the necessary types of supports? Are their parents joining aboard on that? You know what I mean? There's a lot. It's a very, very, very complicated and difficult issue.
Well, it looks like that was our last question.
Nice.
So I just want to thank everyone for all of your great questions and your attention. And thank you so much, Dr. Salimos, for
Can I say
everything.
you're welcome? I love it. And I want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in. And I have to say thank you to my mom, who also tuned in all the way from Canada. And I'm sure that she will have a lot of opinions about this, and we will have a good discussion
That's
about
fantastic.
it.
Thank
So
you
thank you
again.
very much.
Yeah, and just a reminder that when you close out when we close out the panel here, you'll be directed to our survey. So please let us know what you thought of the event tonight. And don't forget that we have one more event this semester on November 10th about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So don't miss that. That is Wednesday, November 10th. So I will see you all there. Thank you so much and have a great night.